The snow fell slowly, as if the sky was too weary to hold on to its burden any longer. The narrow street looked like a long corridor between old houses, all with their lights off or too dim to break through the grey afternoon. David walked with his backpack on his shoulders and his body leaning forward, like someone fighting a wind only he could feel. His steps made no sound on the fresh snow, but each one carried the weight of 4 years away. 4 years trying to build something out there. 4 years believing that distance would be merely geography and not an open wound that no one mentioned in the short phone calls filled with strange silences. Hey, before we dive deeper into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're reading from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. He didn't know that this return would be unlike anything he had imagined. On cold nights in the big city, lying in rented rooms that never felt like home, he mentally pictured his homecoming, his mother's smile at the door, his father's tight hug, the smell of her home cooking, the comforting feeling of belonging somewhere. But reality has a cruel way of reshaping dreams without asking permission. The house that now stood before him, with its crooked gate and peeling paint, wasn't the same one he held in his memory. It was like looking at an old photograph and realizing the image had faded so much you could barely recognize what was there. The yard was overgrown with dry weeds, piles of trash accumulated in one corner, the snow covering everything with a layer that seemed to want to hide the shame. He stopped, on the sidewalk, feeling something cold slide down his spine, a sensation that didn't come from the chill. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind, and that was enough to make his heart pound faster. Eleanor never left the door open, never. She had a habit of double-locking everything, checking the windows before bed, keeping the house as a place protected from the world. Seeing that door ajar was like seeing a crack in the very idea of home. He pushed the gate open slowly, hearing the rusty iron creak, and walked to the entrance. The snow under his feet made a muffled, almost non-existent sound, and he had the feeling he was entering a place that no longer recognized him. The door yielded with a light push, and the smell that came from inside was the first real blow. It wasn't the smell of food, nor cleanliness, nor that comforting mix of soap and coffee he remembered. It was a smell of staleness, of air that had been still for too long, of life that had stopped circulating through the rooms and left everything to wither. The living room was dark, only the faint afternoon light, entering through the dirty window. The photographs that used to adorn the walls were gone or had fallen, leaving lighter stains on the paint. The coffee table was covered in crumpled papers, unopened bills, torn envelopes. The sofa, which once had neatly arranged cushions, now looked like a place where someone slept without caring about anything anymore. Everything there screamed abandonment, but it was a silent scream, the kind that hurts more because no one can truly hear it. He let his backpack slide off his back and fall to the floor with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the empty house, and only then did he realize how utterly quiet everything was. No TV on, no radio, no voices, nothing. Just that heavy silence that seemed to have texture, that clung to his skin and tightened his chest. He took a few steps towards the hallway, trying to control his breathing, which was starting to falter, and that's when he saw her. Eleanor appeared at the entrance of the hallway like a hesitant shadow. She moved slowly, leaning on the wall. Her body stooped in a way he had never seen before. The woman who had always been full of energy, who ran from the kitchen to the living room carrying heavy pots and talking non-stop, now seemed to have shrunk. Her shoulders slumped, her face etched with wrinkles that weren't there 4 years ago. Her deep-set eyes trying to form a smile that didn't quite materialize. She looked at him, and for a second seemed not to recognize him, as if the son who returned was an apparition she wasn't prepared to receive. "You're back," she said, and her voice came out weak, trembling, as if she was afraid that speaking louder might break something. He took a step forward, but something in her gaze made him stop midway. It wasn't happiness he saw there. It was something else. It was relief mixed with terror. It was joy crossed by something dark she was trying to hide. Her hands trembled as she clutched the wall tighter, and he realized she was preparing for something, choosing words she didn't want to say, holding truths that weighed too heavily. "Mom, what happened here?" She averted her gaze, fixing her eyes on the floor as if searching for courage in the old floorboards. Her lips moved, but no sound came. "Out." He waited, feeling time stretch like a rubber band about to snap, and then she finally took a deep breath and said in a voice he barely recognized, "Your father. He's in the basement." Those words fell between them like stones thrown into still water. He blinked, trying to process, trying to understand why this sounded so wrong, why each syllable seemed to carry a weight beyond what was being said. His father in the basement. His father who always occupied the armchair in the living room, who read the newspaper on the porch, who fixed things around the key house, who was a firm and constant presence. The basement was where they stored old tools, forgotten boxes, unimportant things. It wasn't a place for people. "Why is he in the basement?" Eleanor didn't answer. She just pointed to the door at the end of the hallway, the one that led downstairs, and then leaned back against the wall as if that gesture had consumed all the energy she had left. He looked at her once more, searching for an explanation in her tired face, but all he saw was fear, fear of him finding out, fear of him judging, fear that the truth, when it came to light, would be too big to fit in that cramped, cold house. He walked down the hallway with slow steps, feeling the floor groan beneath his feet. The basement door was closed, and when he placed his hand on the doorknob, he felt it was icy cold, truly cold, as if there was no warmth on the other side. He turned it slowly, the metal creaking, and then opened it. The stairs descended into darkness, only a faint light coming from below, a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying gently in the damp air. The smell that rose up the stairs was of mold, of a place closed up for months, of complete abandonment. He began to descend, holding onto the wooden handrail that was loose and crooked, each step making a hollow sound that echoed through the empty space. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, and his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw it. His father lay on a thin mattress thrown directly on the concrete floor. There was no bed, no furniture, just that stained mattress and an old blanket that barely covered his too thin body. The man he remembered, strong and resolute, was now a pile of bones covered by pale skin, his hair overgrown and dirty, his beard unshaven, his deep-set eyes slowly turned towards him with an expression that mixed shame and relief. "Dad!" The word came out in a whisper, almost a breath, because there was no strength within him for more than that. He knelt beside the mattress, feeling the cold concrete seep through his pants, and reached out, touching his father's shoulder carefully, like someone touching something that might break. The old man said nothing, just closed his eyes, and 2 tears ran down his temples, disappearing into his disheveled hair. In that moment, in that faint light of the damp basement, with the smell of mold filling his nose and the cold rising through his legs, he understood that he had returned to a silent nightmare, a nightmare no one told him about in quick calls, no one mentioned in short messages, one that had grown slowly like an infected wound everyone pretended not to see. He stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor, holding his father's cold hand, trying to understand how it had come to this point. 4 years away, 4 years building a life, sending money when he could, calling on weekends, believing everything was fine. And now he was back to this scene that seemed ripped from a horror movie, but it was real. It was his family, It was his responsibility that he had left behind. His father's voice came out hoarse, each word seeming to cost immense effort. You didn't have to come back. And that hurt more than anything else. It hurt because it sounded true. It hurt because there was resignation there, as if the old man had given up waiting, believing someone would come, imagining things could change. He squeezed his father's hand tighter, feeling the thin bones under the skin, and for the first time in a long time, allowed the tears to come. But the tears weren't just sadness, they were anger too. Anger at himself for being away, anger at whoever had let this happen, anger at a world where people reach this point and no one does anything. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and stood up, looking around the basement as if searching for clues, answers, anything that would explain that absurd situation. There were boxes piled in a corner, rusty tools strewn on the floor, a broken chair leaning against the wall. And then he saw, on top of an old box, a plate with remnants of cold, hard food, an empty plastic cup, a dirty spoon. This was where his father ate. This was where he lived, like an animal forgotten in a dark corner of the house. He climbed the stairs with heavy steps, feeling his blood boil in his veins. Eleanor was still in the hallway, in the same spot, like a pillar of salt. He stopped in front of her, trying to control his voice, trying not to scream, but he couldn't hold it all back. How did this happen? She didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him with those tired eyes that seemed to have given up on everything, and then, slowly, like someone confessing a crime she had kept for years, she began to speak. Canto 2. Eleanor spoke slowly, each word coming out as if torn from a deep place within her. She said that at first everything was still fine, that Robert was still the same, man, strong and present. But then something changed. She couldn't say exactly when, maybe a year after David had left, maybe before. Things happened gradually, without anyone really noticing. Robert started forgetting small things, where he'd left his keys, if he'd already had coffee, the name of the neighbor who'd lived there for 20 years. At first, she thought it was tiredness, old age setting in, nothing major. But the forgetfulness grew, became more frequent, more frightening. He'd leave the house and not remember the way back. He'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking he needed to go to work, even though he'd been retired for years. He'd call her by his mother's name, dead for decades. And then came the moments of confusion, of baseless anger, of sudden crying without knowing why. "I didn't know what to do," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried to take him to the doctor, but he didn't want to go. He said everything was fine, that I was exaggerating, and I couldn't force him." He listened in silence, feeling his stomach churn, feeling anger grow not only against her, but against the whole situation, against the invisible illness that was stealing his father piece by piece. But there was still a question he didn't want to ask, but needed to. What about my brother? Where is Michael in all of this? The silence that followed was different. It was a silence that had form, that occupied space between them like a third person. Eleanor averted her gaze again, her hands trembling even more, and he realized they had reached the point she feared most. The point where the story truly turned ugly. Your brother. He tried to help. In the beginning, he tried. She paused, took a deep breath, searching for strength she no longer had, and continued. His older brother Michael had stayed in town when David left. He had promised to take care of their parents, to be close, to be the present son. And he was, for a while. But caring for someone who is losing their mind isn't an easy task. It's pure exhaustion. It's seeing the same person who raised you turn into a confused and frightened child. It's cleaning, It's feeding. It's having patience when there isn't enough patience in the world. And Michael got tired. Tired of carrying alone a burden that should have been shared. Tired of giving up his own life while David was away building his. Tired of being the only one who stayed. And then, gradually, tiredness turned into anger. Anger at his father for being sick. Anger at his brother who left. Anger at a life that hadn't turned out as he'd planned. "He started drinking," Eleanor said, her voice almost disappearing. "And when he drank, he became different." David felt the ground slip beneath his feet. She didn't need to say anything more. He already understood. He already saw the complete picture forming in his head. And it was worse than he had imagined. Michael, crushed by the weight of caring alone, drowning in drink, taking out his frustration on his father for a life that had turned into a prison. And Eleanor, too weak to confront her son, too afraid to ask for help, letting everything happen because she didn't know how to stop it. Where is he now? He left 3 weeks ago. Said he needed a break, that he couldn't take it anymore, and he hasn't come back. 3 weeks. 3 weeks that Robert had been there alone, in the basement, forgotten, abandoned like an old dog no one wanted anymore. 3 weeks that Eleanor had gone up and down those stairs with plates of cold food, trying to keep the old man alive without the strength for more than that. 3 weeks that she had carried the shame and fear alone, waiting for someone to arrive to share that burden. He turned his back on her and went back to the basement. He descended the stairs again, this time with firmer, more determined steps. Robert was still in the same place, his eyes closed, his breathing weak but constant. David knelt again and ran his hand through the old man's dirty hair, feeling the accumulated grime, the smell of someone who hadn't bathed in too long. "Dad, I'm going to get you out of here." Robert opened his eyes slowly, and there was so much in that look that it was hard to separate one emotion from another. Relief, shame, fear, hope, all mixed together, all too heavy to fit into two tired pupils. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse sound came out, and then he gave up, closing his eyes again, like someone who no longer had the energy to fight. David started right there. He picked his father up in his arms, feeling how light his body was, how the bones seemed loose within the skin, and carried him carefully up the stairs, one step at a time. Eleanor was waiting at the top, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide, and when she saw her son carrying her husband up the stairs, something in her finally broke. She began to cry, a low, continuous sob, as if she was letting out everything she had held back for months. He took his father to the bathroom and sat him on the edge of the tub. Eleanor brought clean towels, soap, shampoo, everything she had saved and hadn't dared to use alone. He filled the tub with warm water and slowly took off his father's dirty clothes. Each piece that fell to the floor revealed more marks, more signs of neglect, more proof of what had happened. There were bruises on his arms, marks from falls, scratches, rashes. He swallowed his anger and continued, because now was not the time to fall apart. Now was the time to fix things. He bathed his father as if caring for a child. He washed his hair carefully, soaped his fragile body, rinsed everything with clean water that ran off, carrying away the dirt, the smell, the humiliation. The old man didn't react much, just stayed there, letting himself be cared for. And every now and then a sigh escaped him, a sigh that seemed to bring back a bit of dignity. When he finished, he dried his father with a fluffy towel and dressed him in clean clothes that Eleanor brought from the closet. Clothes that still smelled of mothballs, but were infinitely better than the rags he had been wearing. Then he took the old man to the master bedroom, the one that used to be theirs, and laid him on the double bed which had clean sheets that looked like they hadn't been used in ages. Robert sank into the soft mattress like someone sinking into an embrace. He closed his eyes and for the first time since David had arrived seemed to truly relax. His breathing became calmer, his tense muscles loosened, and in a few minutes he was sleeping, a deep sleep of someone who finally felt safe. He left the room and found Eleanor sitting in the living room on the old sofa, still crying softly. He sat beside her and stayed there, saying nothing, just letting her pour out everything at once. She spoke between sobs, repeated things she had already said, justified herself in ways that made no sense, and he just listened, because part of him understood. He understood the fear, the loneliness, the feeling of sinking without anyone to ask for help. But another part of him, the part that was still full of anger, knew that this couldn't continue, that no matter how much she had suffered, how much she had been afraid, nothing justified leaving a man to rot in a basement. Nothing justified silently accepting while her own son turned his father into nothing. "Mom, we need to find Michael." She stopped crying for a second and looked at him with red, swollen eyes. "It's no use," she said. "He won't come back. He said he was tired, that it wasn't his responsibility, that what?" She hesitated, bit her lip, and then spit out the words like venom. That Dad wasn't his problem, that everyone had to take care of their own life, that you left and he stayed, so now it was fair for him to leave too. Those words were like punches. Each one hit hard, and he felt the anger returning, only now it was different. It wasn't just anger at Michael, it was anger at himself, because deep down he knew he bore a share of the blame for all of this. He had left Michael alone. He had called once in a while and thought everything was fine because no one complained directly. But now was not the time for self-blame. Now was the time to act. He stood up, went to the kitchen, and started rummaging through the drawers, looking for something, anything that would give clues about where Michael might be. He found overdue bills, shut-off notices from the utility company, bank letters. He found an old notebook where Eleanor noted expenses, and there, between numbers and dates, were loose annotations that looked like notes to herself. Talk to him about Dad. Ask him to drink less. Try calling the other one. He flipped through the pages, looking for more, and then found something that made his blood run cold. It was a list of expenses, and among them were several notes, money for drinks, lent to him $200, another $150. The amounts repeated, page after page, month after month. Michael wasn't just drinking, he was taking money from his mother. He was bleeding the house dry while letting his father rot. He closed the notebook with a slam and went back to the living room. Eleanor was still on the sofa, now with her hands on her face, hiding what dignity she had left. He sat in front of her, forcing her to look at him. "Mom, I need you to tell me everything. Everything. Where does he usually go? Who are his friends? Anything that might help me find him." She took a deep breath and began to speak. She talked about the corner bar where he spent his nights, about a friend, Tony, who had an auto shop across town, about an ex-girlfriend, Sarah, he still saw sometimes. Each piece of information was a puzzle piece, and he put it together in his head, planning his next steps. But before going out to look for Michael, there were more urgent things to do. Robert needed medical care. He needed medicine, tests, follow-up. He picked up the phone and started making calls, trying to schedule appointments, trying to find a community health clinic that could see them quickly. The bureaucracy was a slow, weary monster, but he insisted, he pushed, and he managed to schedule an appointment for the next day. Meanwhile, he started cleaning the house. He collected the accumulated trash, washed the dirty dishes, swept and mopped the floor. Eleanor tried to help, but he asked her to rest, saying she had carried enough weight alone. She obeyed and went to lie down, and he continued cleaning, each movement a way to try to bring order to the chaos the house had become. When night fell, the house was already different. It still smelled stale, but it was less intense. The surfaces were clean, the kitchen organized, the living room minimally presentable. He prepared a simple soup and took a bowl to his father, who was still sleeping. He woke the old man carefully and helped him sit up, holding the spoon and bringing it to his mouth, each spoonful a gesture of love that tried to compensate for months of abandonment. Robert ate slowly, and with each bite seemed to return a little more to the world of the living. When he finished, David wiped the old man's mouth with a napkin and laid him down again, covering him with the blanket up to his chin. He sat there on the edge of the bed, looking at that tired face, at those wrinkles that told stories of a lifetime, and felt a tightness in his chest that almost made it hard to breathe. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry I wasn't here." Robert didn't answer. Maybe he hadn't heard. Maybe he was asleep again. Or maybe he just didn't have the strength to speak. But it didn't matter. David had said what he needed to say, and now what mattered was what he would do from now on. Chapter 3. The next day arrived with a sky still grey, but no snow. The town seemed to have woken up slowly, like someone who slept poorly and doesn't want to face what's ahead. David got up early, made coffee, toast, and brought breakfast to his father. Robert ate a little more than the night before, and there was something different in his eyes. He was still confused, still tired, but seemed less lost, as if being back in his own bed, clean and fed, had lit a small light inside him. The doctor's appointment was scheduled for 10 in the morning. David helped his father dress, choosing warm clothes because of the cold outside, and then took him to the car he had rented at the airport. Robert got in slowly, with difficulty, and David had to help him buckle his seatbelt. Throughout the drive to the community health clinic, Robert kept looking out the window, observing the town he had known for decades, as if it were the first time he was seeing it. At the clinic, the wait was long. The place was crowded with people, mothers with children on their laps, old men with canes, people coughing, people complaining. David sat there beside his father, holding his hand, feeling time stretch. When they were finally called, they entered a small room where a young doctor, Dr. Emily Carter, greeted them with a tired smile. She asked questions, many questions. When did the symptoms start? What kind of forgetfulness? Was there a family history? He answered what he knew, and what he didn't know, he tried to guess from the story Eleanor had told. Dr. Carter examined Robert, tested his reflexes, asked direct questions that he couldn't answer properly. In the end, she sighed and said what David already expected to hear. "It looks like dementia. Probably Alzheimer's, but only more detailed tests can confirm. I'll refer him to a neurologist, but the waiting list is long. It could take months." Months. He swallowed his frustration and asked about medicine, about treatment, about anything that could help now. She prescribed some basic medications, explained about care, about routine, about patience. She spoke as if it were simple, as if caring for someone with dementia was just following a step-by-step guide, but he knew it wasn't. He knew it was exhaustion, total dedication, giving up one's own life. He knew because he had seen what it had done to Michael. On the way home, he stopped at a pharmacy and bought the medicine. They were expensive, more expensive than he expected, and he had to use his credit card, already maxed out. But it didn't matter. His father needed it, so he would pay. Arriving home, he gave the old man the first pill with a glass of water and helped him back to bed. Robert fell asleep again almost immediately, and David took the opportunity to leave. It was time to look for Michael. He started with the corner bar Eleanor had mentioned. It was a small place on the main street, with an old wooden door and a faded sign. He entered in the middle of the afternoon, when the place was still empty, only the owner, Frank, cleaning the counter. David introduced himself, said who he was looking for, and the man behind the counter looked at him with an expression that mixed pity and discomfort. "Your brother, Michael? He used to come here every day, drank until he couldn't stand it and stumbled out, but he hasn't shown up for about 3 weeks. Did he say where he was going?" Frank shook his head. "No. But the last time he was here, he was arguing on the phone with someone, talking loud, agitated. Said something about not being able to take it anymore, about needing to disappear. Then he paid his tab and left. Hasn't been back." David thanked him and left with more questions than answers. The next stop was Tony's auto shop. It was across town, on an industrial street full of rusty warehouses and vacant lots. When he got there, he found a man in dirty overalls working on an engine. He approached and asked about Michael. Tony put down his wrench and turned around, wiping his hands on a rag already black with grease. "He owes money here, borrowed it saying he'd pay it back soon, but he never did. If you know where he is, you can tell him to show up, because we're going to have a serious talk." "I don't know where he is. I'm looking for him." The man shrugged, uninterested, and went back to the engine. David stood there for a few more seconds, trying to decide whether to insist or not, but realized he wouldn't get anything out of him. He left the shop and stopped in the middle of the street looking around, feeling the weight of frustration. Michael seemed to have really disappeared. He had cut all ties, vanished without a trace, fled his own mess. But David wasn't going to give up. He returned to the neighborhood where they had grown up and started knocking on doors, talking to old neighbors. Most remembered him, the younger son who had left to try his luck elsewhere. Some asked how he was, if things had worked out, and he replied with half-truths, quickly redirecting to questions about Michael and their parents. It was in one of these conversations that he got the first truly useful information. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down, invited him in and offered coffee. She spoke slowly, with the manner of someone who has time and wants to tell everything in minute detail. "I saw a lot, son. I saw your brother come. Home drunk, arguing with your mother, slamming doors. I saw your father sitting on the porch alone, staring into space, and no one paying him any mind. Once I tried to talk to your mother, offer help, but she said everything was fine. But it wasn't. Anyone with eyes could see it wasn't. Do you know anything about Michael? Where he might have gone?" She took a sip of coffee and thought, frowning. "There was one time he mentioned to me a few months ago that he wanted to leave. Said he wanted to start over somewhere else, that there was nothing left for him here. Talked about going down south, working the harvest. I don't know, but I don't know if he really went or if it was just drunken talk." He mentally noted the information and thanked her. He spent the rest of the afternoon talking to other people, assembling a mosaic of fragmented stories, loose observations, clues that sometimes led nowhere. When night fell, he returned home, tired, frustrated, but with at least one direction. Michael had talked about going down south. It wasn't much, but it was something. At home, he found Eleanor in the kitchen, preparing soup. She seemed a little better, less worn out than the day before. He told her what he had discovered, and she listened in silence, stirring the pot slowly, her eyes fixed on the rising steam. "He always talked about leaving," she said when he finished, "ever since he was young. Said this town was too small, that he deserved better. And when you left and succeeded, I think that hurt him. It hurt because he stayed, and he stayed with all the heavy burdens. But that doesn't justify what he did to Dad." "I know," she said, her voice heavy with sadness. "I know it doesn't justify it, but understanding isn't the same as justifying. And I need to understand, otherwise I can't move forward." They ate dinner in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Afterward, he went to check on his father, who was still sleeping, breathing peacefully. He stood there at the bedroom door, watching, and for the first time since he had returned, felt something akin to hope. His father was clean, fed, medicated. The house was organized. His mother seemed less broken. Nothing was all right, far from it, but it was better than it had been, and that was something. That night, lying on the sofa bed because his old room had become a storage space, he stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything. He thought about Michael running from his own shadow. He thought about his father slowly losing his mind. He thought about Eleanor enduring alone until she couldn't anymore. And he thought about himself, about the choice he had made to leave, to seek something better, to believe that sending money and calling once in a while was enough. It wasn't. It never had been. And now he was there, 4 years later, trying to pick up the pieces of a family that had broken while he was away. Was it his fault? In part, yes. But blame didn't fix anything. Action did. And he was determined to act, to do whatever it took to put that family back on track, even if it meant confronting Michael, even if it meant painful truths, even if it meant giving up the life he had built out there. But first, he needed to find Michael. He needed to look him in the eye and hear his side of the story. He needed to understand what had truly happened, not just the fragments everyone told, because deep down he knew that every story has more than one side, and that sometimes the truth lies precisely in the middle, in the place where no one wants to look because it hurts too much. The next day he woke up determined. He would seek more information about Michael's ex-girlfriend. If anyone would know where he had gone, it would be Sarah. He had a quick coffee, checked if his father had taken his medicine, left instructions with Eleanor, and left. Sarah lived in an old building downtown. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door. A woman in her early 30s opened it, looking sleepy with a cigarette in her hand. When he introduced himself and said he was looking for Michael, she made a disgusted face. "That jerk? If I knew where he was, I would have already sent someone to collect the money he owes me." "He owes you money?" "He does. A lot. He promised he'd pay it back, that he was waiting for some money to come through, but it never did. Typical of him, promise and never deliver. Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" She took a long drag from her cigarette and slowly blew out the smoke, thinking. "He used to talk a lot about a cousin, Jim, who lives in some small town near the state line. Said if everything ever went wrong, he'd go there, that Jim had guaranteed farm work, but I don't know if he actually went. I haven't talked to him in almost a month." He wrote down the name of the town she mentioned and thanked her. It was another clue, another piece of the puzzle. When he returned home, he sat with Eleanor and showed her what he had discovered. She confirmed that Michael did indeed have a cousin living in that region, but she didn't know the exact address. He picked up the phone and started making calls, trying to track down Jim. It took hours, several calls to distant relatives, questions, explanations, until he finally got a number. He called, and a tired male voice answered on the other end. "Hello? Are you Michael's cousin?" And he said Michael's name. There was a silence on the other end, and then, "I am. Why? Is he there with you?" Another silence, longer this time, and then the answer he both expected and feared. "Yeah." Chapter 4. The town was almost 120 miles away, near the state line, in a region of farms and fields he only knew by reputation. He wrote down the address Jim gave him, after much insistence and a few lies about just wanting to talk. He hung up the phone and stood there, holding the paper with the address, feeling his heart quicken. He had finally found him. He would finally hear Michael's side, look him in the eyes, and listen to what he had to say, but he couldn't go immediately. He had his father to care for, Eleanor who was still fragile, the house that needed attention. He spent 2 more days organizing everything. He talked to Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor, and asked her to keep an eye on his parents while he was away. She gladly accepted, said she would stop by twice a day to check if everything was okay. He left money for groceries, extra medicine, written instructions about his father's pill schedule. On the morning of his departure, he woke up, while it was still dark. He made coffee, set the table, wrote a note explaining where he was going and when he would be back. He entered his parents' bedroom, saw his father sleeping peacefully and his mother awake, staring at the ceiling. She turned her head when he entered and gave a tired half-smile. Going to get him. I'm going to talk to him. And then, he didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if Michael would return, if he would agree to talk, if there would be forgiveness or just more pain. But he knew he had to try. He kissed Eleanor's forehead, then Robert's, who was still asleep, and left. The road was long and monotonous. Dirt fields on one side, plantations on the other, a grey sky that seemed never to change. He drove on autopilot, his mind wandering between memories and loose thoughts. He remembered when they were children, he and Michael, playing in the old backyard. He remembered the silly fights, the quick reconciliations, the complicity that existed before life complicated everything. At what point had they grown so distant? At what point had they stopped being true brothers and become just two guys with the same last name? The answer wasn't simple. It had been gradual. A little when he decided to leave. A little when Michael stayed and started carrying the burden alone. A little when their father got sick and no one knew how to cope. A little when tiredness turned into anger and anger turned into drink. And then one day you wake up and realize that the distance isn't just physical anymore. It's emotional. It's a chasm that grew without anyone noticing. He arrived in town in the late afternoon. It was smaller than he imagined, almost a hamlet with dirt roads and scattered houses. He followed the address Jim had given him and stopped in front of a simple wooden house with a small porch and a dog sleeping by the door. He turned off the engine and sat there for a minute, 2, 3, trying to gather courage. When he finally got out of the car, the dog raised its head, looked at him without much interest, and went back to sleep. He walked up the porch steps and knocked on the door. Heavy footsteps on the other side. And then the door opened. Jim was a large man with a full beard and calloused hands. He looked David up and down and nodded. "You must be the brother." "I am." "He's inside. But I'll warn you, he's not having a good day." He entered, the smell of home cooking in the air, and followed Jim to the back of the house. There was a closed door, and Jim stopped in front of it, knocked twice, and waited. A hoarse voice came from inside. "What?" "You have a visitor." Silence. Then shuffling footsteps and the door slowly opening. And there he was, Michael, 4 years older than the last time they had seen each other, but looking like he had aged 10. His face was marked, his eyes deep-set, his beard unshaven, the smell of cigarette and alcohol clinging to his clothes. He looked at his younger brother, and something crossed his face. Surprise, anger, fear, all at once, all quickly. "What do you want here?" The voice came out rougher than David remembered, laden with alcohol and resentment. David took a deep breath, tried to stay calm, and replied, "I came to talk." "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is, a lot." Michael made to close the door, but David put his foot in the way, preventing it. "You're going to listen to me, even if it's the last thing you do." There was a moment of tension, the two staring at each other, measuring forces, and then Michael backed down, shrugged, and opened the door. David entered a small, messy room with clothes strewn on the floor and empty bottles piled in a corner. There was an unmade bed and a broken chair. Michael sat on the bed and lit a cigarette, blowing the smoke upwards. "Just say what you came to say." David stood, leaning against the wall, trying to organize his thoughts. There was so much to say, so much accumulated anger, so much he wanted to scream. But he knew screaming wouldn't help. He knew he needed to be direct, precise, truthful. "I saw Dad. I saw the state you left him in." Michael took a long drag and didn't answer. He just looked at the floor, his jaw tight. You left him in the basement, abandoned, like he was trash. You don't know anything. Michael's voice came out low, controlled, but full, of something dangerous. Then explain it to me. Explain how you got to this point. Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a bitter laugh, full of contempt. You want me to explain? You, who left and abandoned me with everything? You, who called once in a while to ask if everything was okay and didn't want to hear that it wasn't? You want an explanation. I sent money. I tried to help. Money! He spit the word out like venom. You think money solves everything? You think money cleans up after an old man puts food in his mouth, endures midnight screams, cleans up messes, puts up with seeing your own father forget who you are? His voice rose, each word coming out with more force, more anger, more pain. I stayed here, taking care, enduring, while you were out there building your life. And at first I endured. I endured because I thought it was my responsibility. But you know what happens when you endure alone for too long? You break. You just break. And I broke. He stopped talking, breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he held the cigarette. There were tears in his eyes, but he wouldn't let them fall. He just blinked, swallowed hard, and continued, You don't know what it's like to see your father look at you and not know who you are. You don't know what it's like to bathe him because he can't do it alone anymore. You don't know what it's like to wake up in the middle of the night because he's left the house and is walking down the street in his pajamas, lost. You don't know what it's like to have to give up your life, your dreams, everything, because someone needs to stay. And guess who stayed? Me. While you were out there, I was here, alone. He stopped again, threw the cigarette on the floor and stepped on it. And then the drinking started, because it was the only way to cope, the only way to sleep without dreaming about all of it. And then the drinking became more important than Dad, and then I started to hate him for being sick, hate you for leaving, hate myself for not being able to handle it. His voice broke at the end, and he covered his face with his hands. He stayed like that for a few seconds, and when he lowered his hands, he was truly crying, crying like someone letting out everything they had held back for years. I didn't want to do that. I swear I didn't, but I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stand seeing him like that. I couldn't stand seeing Mom looking at me with that disappointed face. I couldn't stand waking up every day knowing it would be the same thing, the same hell, every day, endlessly. So I ran. I ran because I didn't know what else to do. He got up from the bed and stood in front of David, his eyes red, his face wet. You can judge me. You can call me whatever you want. You can say I'm a monster. And maybe you're right. But before you judge me, think about what you would have done if you had been in my shoes. Think if you would have endured, because I doubt it. I highly doubt it. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed solid. David stood there, leaning against the wall, processing everything he had just heard. Part of him was still angry. Angry at the way Michael had treated their father, at the way he had fled, at everything. But another part, a part he didn't want to admit, understood. He understood the tiredness, the loneliness, the despair. He understood because he knew he himself had contributed to it. He had left. He had left Michael alone. He had thought sending money was enough. You're right, he said finally, his voice low. I don't know what I would have done in your place. And you're right to be angry at me. I should have stayed, or at least I should have come back sooner, but I didn't. And now here we are in this screwed-up situation, and we need to decide what we're going to do. Michael wiped his face with the back of his hand and sat on the bed again, exhausted. What do you want me to do? I want you to come back. He let out a humorless laugh. Come back for what? To continue the same thing? No, for us to do it together. You won't be alone anymore. I'm going to stay too. We're going to share this. We're going to take care of Dad together, Mom. The house. Together, like it should have been from the start. Michael looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and hope. What about your life out there, your work, your things? I'll give it up. It's not worth having a life out there if everything here is falling apart. You say that now. But what about later? What about when you get tired? What about when you see it's too hard? Then we endure, together, because that's what family does. Michael fell silent, looking at his own hands. Hands that had done wrong things, that had hurt, that had failed. But they were the same hands that had once cared, that had tried, that had endured until they couldn't anymore. I don't know if I can, he said, his voice weak. You can. We can. They stayed like that. The two of them in the messy room, the silence now different, less heavy, almost hopeful. It wasn't complete forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting. But it was a beginning. It was a crack in the wall of anger and resentment through which light began to enter. Chapter 5. The drive back was different. Michael was in the passenger seat, quiet, looking out the window, smoking occasionally. David drove in silence, giving them both time to process everything that had been said. There was no magic there, no instant solution. What there was were two wounded people trying to find a path together, knowing it would be difficult, that there would be stumbling blocks, that the pain wouldn't disappear just because you decided to face it. At a gas station halfway, they stopped to refuel and grab a bite. They sat at a plastic table with lousy sandwiches and watery coffee, and for the first time, Michael spoke on his own. Accord. Does Mom know you went to get me? She knows. I left a note. And Dad? He's better. Medicated, clean, eating properly. Still confused, but better. Michael looked at the sandwich in front of him without eating. I'm scared, he said softly. Scared to go back and not be able to look him in the eye. Scared to see the disappointment in Mom's eyes. Scared that I won't be able to handle it again and end up screwing things up. We'll handle it together. I told you. You won't be alone this time. What if I mess everything up? Again. Then we fix it. As many times as it takes. Michael finally ate, slowly, and then lit another cigarette. They stayed there for another half hour, unhurried, letting time pass. When they got back in the car, the mood was a little lighter. It wasn't friendship yet. It wasn't full trust, but it was something. It was the possibility of rebuilding what had been broken. They arrived home as night had already fallen. The lights were on, and through the window they could see Eleanor's silhouette in the kitchen. They stood in front of the gate for a moment, both looking at the house, and then Michael took a deep breath and said, "Let's go." They entered together. Eleanor was washing dishes when she heard the sound of the door. She turned, saw them both there, and her hands began to tremble. The plate she was holding almost slipped, but she managed to put it in the sink in time. She dried her hands on her apron and stood there, unsure what to do, what to say. Michael took a hesitant step forward and stopped. His eyes were red again, but he didn't cry. He just said, his voice hoarse, "I'm sorry, Mom." And that was enough for her to break down. She crossed the kitchen in quick steps and hugged her son tightly, sobbing against his chest. He stood there, stiff at first, unsure how to react, and then slowly he softened, hugging her back, letting her cry out everything she had held in. They stayed like that for long enough, mother and son reuniting in the middle of the kitchen, and David watched from a distance, feeling something tighten in his chest. It wasn't complete happiness. It was something more complex. It was relief mixed with sadness, hope crossed with fear. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. When Eleanor finally let go, she looked at her two sons, wiped her face with her hands and said, "Let's eat dinner. I made food for you both." They sat at the table, the three of them, and ate in silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, it was just silence, the kind that happens when words are no longer necessary because gestures have already said everything. Eleanor served more food, Michael ate with an appetite for the first time in weeks, and David just watched, grateful for that small, fragile moment. After dinner, Michael asked to see his father. They went upstairs together, the two of them, and stopped at the bedroom door. Robert was awake, sitting in bed, looking at his own hands. When they entered, he looked up, and for a second seemed not to recognize anyone. But then something flickered deep in that confused gaze, and he said, his voice weak, "You're back." It wasn't clear if he was speaking to one or the other, or both. But it didn't matter. Michael approached slowly, knelt beside the bed, and held his father's hand, the hand he had abandoned, that he had left alone, that he had unintentionally hurt. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, and this time the tears came. "I'm sorry for everything." Robert didn't respond with words. Maybe he didn't quite understand what was happening. Maybe the disease had already taken away his ability to process it all. But he squeezed his son's hand back, and that was enough. It was silent forgiveness. It was acceptance. It was love that survives even when memory fails. In the days that followed, they established a routine. They woke up early, took turns, giving their father breakfast, bathing him, changing his clothes, giving him medicine. Eleanor cooked, they cleaned, and gradually the house began to feel alive again. It wasn't the life before. It never would be. But it was a new life, built on the rubble of what had broken. Michael stopped drinking. It wasn't easy. There were nights he woke up sweating, trembling, wanting to run to the nearest bar. But he stayed, because David was there by his side, waking up with him, talking until the craving passed. And little by little, day after day, it got easier. They talked a lot during those days. Conversations that should have happened years ago, about their childhood, about the dreams they had and had put aside, about the choices they made and the paths they took. It wasn't therapy. It was just two brothers reconnecting, trying to understand each other, trying to forgive not only the other, but themselves. One afternoon, while Robert slept and Eleanor rested in the living room, they went out to the backyard. It was cold, but not snowing. The sky was clear, a rare moment of sun that warmed their hearts more than their bodies. They sat on the half-dry grass, side by side, and stayed there in silence for a while. "Thanks," Michael said suddenly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For coming to get me, for giving me a second chance. You're my brother. I wasn't going to give up." "A lot of people would have." "I'm not a lot of people." Michael smiled, a small but genuine smile, and looked at the sky. "I'm still scared," he confessed. "Scared of not being able to do it. Scared that the anger will come back. Scared that I'll mess everything up again. There will be bad days. There will be moments when you'll want to give up, but in those moments you come to me and we'll handle it together." "And you? Aren't you afraid of having given up your life?" "I am," David admitted. "I'm afraid of regretting it. I'm afraid of looking back years from now and thinking I made the wrong choice, but I'm more afraid of not having tried. More afraid of having let everything fall apart and doing nothing." They stayed there until the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, and for the first time in a long time, both felt something akin to peace. It wasn't complete happiness. It wasn't a movie happy ending, but it was a beginning. It was the possibility that, despite everything, they could make it. Inside the house, Eleanor watched them both through the window, and a tear ran down her face. But this time it wasn't sadness. It was relief. It was gratitude. It was the feeling that her family, broken and bruised, was beginning to rise again. Robert, in his room, was still sleeping, and in his sleep he smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was there, as if, even in the confusion of his sick mind, he knew his sons had returned, that he was no longer alone, that despite everything there was still love in that house, and love, even wounded, even fragile, was still the strongest thing that existed. It was what kept people together when everything conspired to separate them. It was what made someone come back even when afraid. It was what made someone forgive even when it hurt too much. It was what made a family rise from its own ashes and try again. Night fell slowly, and with it a strange feeling. It wasn't full happiness, but it was close to hope. The house, which days ago seemed like a tomb, now had voices, soft laughter, the smell of food being prepared. Life was slowly returning, timidly, but returning. Before going to bed, David entered his father's room one last time. Robert was awake, staring at the ceiling, and when he felt his son's presence, he turned his head. For an instant, there was clear recognition in his eyes. Recognition and gratitude. "Thank you for coming back," Robert said, his voice weak but firm. David felt a lump in his throat and just nodded, not trusting his own voice. He adjusted his father's blanket, kissed his forehead, and left the room. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and let the tears come. Tears of relief, of pain, of love. Tears that needed to be shed so he could continue. And as he cried there, alone in the dark hallway, he knew he had made the right choice. That no matter what came next, no matter how difficult, he would be there. For his father, for his mother, for his brother, for the family that almost got lost but was fighting to find itself again. Chapter 6. Weeks passed, and with them the house gained a routine that almost seemed normal. Almost. Because nothing was truly normal when you cared for someone with dementia. There were good days when Robert woke up lucid, remembered everyone's names, told old stories with details that seemed to have been preserved in some corner of his memory. And there were bad days when he didn't know where he was, called for his parents who had been dead for decades, became agitated for no apparent reason. But now there were two caring, two sharing the burden. When one got tired, the other took over. When one lost patience, the other intervened. It was teamwork, imperfect and improvised, but it worked. And gradually, Michael began to return to the person David remembered. Not completely. The marks were still there, in the dark circles under his eyes, in the nervous way he fidgeted with his hands, in the way he sometimes stared into space with a distant expression. But he was better. He was trying. One afternoon, while Robert slept and Eleanor had gone shopping, the two brothers were in the kitchen, drinking coffee. Michael stirred the sugar at the bottom of his cup, pensive, and then said, "Do you think about going back?" "Go back where?" "Out there, to your life." David thought for a moment. He thought about the small apartment he had rented, the job he had abandoned, the plans he had left behind. He thought about everything he had built alone, far from here, and felt a pang of nostalgia. But it was a small longing, easily ignorable. "There's no life there anymore. My life is here now." "And you don't regret it?" "Not yet. Maybe someday I will. But for now, no." Michael nodded and continued stirring his coffee. "I regret it," he said softly. "I regret letting it get to where it did, for not asking for help sooner, for thinking I could do it alone. Everyone makes mistakes, but not every mistake is this big. No, but every mistake can be fixed, or at least we can try to fix it." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, and then Michael asked, "Christmas is coming. Are we doing anything?" David hadn't thought about it. Christmas had always been an important date for the family. It was a tradition to get together, make too much food, exchange silly gifts, stay up late talking. But this year would be different. It would be the first Christmas with their father sick, with the family newly mended, with wounds still open. "We're doing it," David said, determined. "We'll do it however we can. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be ours." And so the preparations began. Eleanor got into the spirit the moment she found out, and for the first time in months seemed genuinely excited. She made shopping lists, planned the menu, and pulled out old decorations that had been stored for years. The two brothers cleaned the house from top to bottom, repainted the living room, which had peeling paint, fixed things that had been broken for too long. Robert observed everything with curious eyes, not quite understanding what was happening, but feeling the change in the air. He helped in any way he could, holding an end of a curtain while they hung it, passing tools when asked, smiling for no specific reason. And in those moments it was possible to forget for a few seconds that something was wrong. It was possible to see only an old man happy amidst his family. 3 days before Christmas it snowed heavily. The town was covered in white, the streets silent, everything looking cleaner and newer. They lit the fireplace, which hadn't been used in years, and all sat in the living room, watching the fire burn and listening to the crackling of the wood. Robert was sitting in the armchair, wrapped in a blanket, and every now and then he would say something disconnected. But everyone listened attentively, responded as if it made sense, and he seemed content with that. "Remember when we were kids and we'd build snowmen?" Michael said, looking out the window. "I remember. You always made huge ones, and I made small ones because I didn't have the strength to roll the snow. And you always complained that mine were better." "Because they were." They laughed, a light laugh, and Eleanor looked at them both with a tearful smile. These were moments she thought she would never have again. Simple moments of family together, laughing about old silly things. And now they were there, and she held back from crying again. On Christmas Eve they woke up early and started preparing the food. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and an array of desserts. The kitchen felt small with so many people, and every now and then they bumped into each other, laughed, argued about seasonings and cooking times. It was organized chaos, good noise, the smell of home cooking filling the house. Robert was brought into the kitchen and sat in a chair where he watched everything with a smile on his face. Every now and then, someone would stop to give him a kiss or to ask if he wanted to try something, and he accepted like a happy child. The disease was still there, still stealing pieces of him every day, but at that moment it seemed to have called a truce. In the evening they all sat at the table. The table that used to be empty was now full of food, full of people, full of an energy that had been lost and was now slowly being regained. They ate, talked, told old stories. Michael was sober, steady, present. David was there by his side, sharing the weight and the joy. Eleanor's eyes were shining, not with sadness, but with stored happiness. And Robert, even confused, even lost in his own mind, was there, surrounded by love. After dinner, they exchanged simple gifts, inexpensive things, bought with the little money they had, but which meant more than any monetary value. Warm socks, a used book, a tool for house repairs, practical gifts but given with affection, received with gratitude. As the night progressed and everyone started to get sleepy, they took Robert to his room. He was almost asleep, but before lying down, he held the hands of his 2 sons and said, with a sudden lucidity that surprised everyone, "Thank you for being here, thank you for not giving up." And then he closed his eyes and slept, a peaceful sleep, without nightmares, without agitation. The 2 brothers stood there looking at him, feeling the weight of those words. They weren't just words. It was recognition, it was love, It was everything they needed to hear. They left the room and went to the porch. It was cold, but they didn't care. They stood there watching the snow fall slowly, covering everything with a white mantle that seemed to erase the marks of the past. It didn't truly erase them. Of course, the marks were still there, but they became less visible, less painful. It was worth it, Michael said. What? All of this, all the effort, it was worth it. David looked at his brother and saw something different there. He saw hope. He saw peace. He saw a man who had been at rock bottom and was climbing back up, one step at a time. It was, David agreed. They stayed there late, talking about small things, about future plans, about how they would continue to care for their parents, about how they would rebuild their own lives, without giving up on each other. There were no ready answers, there were no guarantees, but there was willingness, there was commitment, and that was more than many people had. When they finally went inside, Eleanor was already sleeping on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket. They covered her better, turned off the lights, and each went to their own corner. David lay on the sofa bed in the living room, looking at the ceiling, feeling the satisfying exhaustion of a full day. A day that had been hard to imagine a few weeks ago, a day that almost didn't happen, but it happened. And that was all that mattered. He closed his eyes and, before falling asleep, thought about his father, about the man he had been, strong and resolute, always present, always firm, and about the man he was now, fragile and confused, dependent on constant care. They were two versions of the same person, and both deserved love, both deserved dignity, both deserved to be cared for, and he was there for that. Not because it was an obligation, but because it was love. Love that survives pain, tiredness, frustration. Love that remains even when everything conspires to destroy it. Love that is the only truly important thing in the end. Sleep came slowly, and with it the feeling that, for the first time in a long time, things were in the right place. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they were right, and that was enough. The next day, Christmas had already passed, but the good feeling lingered. They woke up without haste, had breakfast together, and began to plan the year ahead. There would be challenges, there would be difficult moments, but there would also be them, together, facing everything as a family. And, in the back bedroom, Robert woke up with the sun entering through the window. He didn't know what day it was. He didn't remember Christmas. But there was something different in the air, something light, something good. And when he heard the voices of his sons talking in the kitchen, he smiled. Because even if memory failed, even if the mind got lost, the heart still knew. It knew it was home. It knew it was surrounded by love. And that, in the end, was all that truly mattered. Chapter 7. January arrived with biting cold and clear skies. The kind of cold that aches in the bones but doesn't stop life from going on. The routine continued day after day, with its highs and lows. There were mornings when Robert woke up asking for his own father, dead decades ago, and it took hours to calm him down. There were afternoons when he simply sat in the armchair and stared into space, lost somewhere within his own mind. And there were nights when he woke up startled, thinking he needed to go to work, even though he'd been retired for so long. But there were good moments too. Moments when he remembered his sons, called each one by the correct name, told old jokes that brought out laughter. Moments when he took his wife's hand and said he loved her, with a clarity so striking that it seemed the disease had vanished. These moments were rare, but when they came, they were precious. They were reminders that beneath the confusion there was still a man, there were still feelings, there was still life. The two brothers had found a rhythm. They took turns with the care, each assuming shifts, giving the other time to breathe, rest, have a few moments to themselves. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments, still moments of tension when tiredness hit too hard. But they argued and resolved things. They fought and made up, because now they knew they had each other, and that alone they wouldn't make it. Michael had started looking for work again. He began doing odd jobs, small repair work around the neighborhood, quick home renovations. The money was little, but it helped. And more important than the money was the feeling of doing something, of contributing, of not just being a burden. He still had nightmares sometimes. He still woke up sweating, wanting to drink until he forgot. But then he'd get up, go to David's room, and they would talk until the craving passed. And it always passed. One afternoon, while Robert slept, the two were in the backyard fixing the failing fence. They worked in silence, each with his hammer, nailing old boards that were still good. The sun was weak, but the physical effort kept them warm. "You know this is never going to end, right?" Michael said suddenly. "What?" "The care. Dad's just going to get worse. The disease has no cure. And one day—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Both knew. They knew Robert wouldn't get better. That each day was one day less. That at some point, not far off, he wouldn't be there anymore. And when that day came, it would be devastating. But until then, until that day arrived, they would do everything possible so that the old man had dignity, had love, had a life worth living, even with his confused mind. "I know," David finally replied, "but as long as he's here, we'll take care of him. And when he's no longer here, we'll have done our best, and that's what matters." Michael nodded and went back to nailing the fence, but there was something different in his demeanor now. There was acceptance. It wasn't happiness, it wasn't complete peace, but it was acceptance. It was understanding that life offered no guarantees, that things didn't always go as planned, but that you could choose how to react. You could choose to flee or to face, and he had chosen to face. That night after dinner, Eleanor asked to talk. They all sat in the living room, the fireplace lit, Robert sleeping in his room. She seemed nervous, her hands fidgeting in her lap, and her two sons waited in silence. "I need to say something," she began, her voice trembling. "I need to thank you both for coming back, for staying, for having saved us. Because that's what it was. Your father and I were sinking, and you saved us." Her eyes were wet, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of love. "I know I failed," she continued. "I know I should have asked for help sooner. I should have told the truth on the phone calls. I should have screamed for help. But I was ashamed. Ashamed to admit I couldn't handle it. Ashamed to show that our family was broken. And because of that, I let everything get worse than it should have." "Mom," David began, but she raised her hand. "Let me finish. I need to say this. You two are the best sons I could ever have, and I don't deserve you. But I am grateful every day to have you, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the mother you deserve." She paused, wiped her tears and smiled, a weak but genuine smile. And the two sons stood up and hugged her, the three of them together, in a tight embrace that said more than 1,000 words ever could. Days passed, turning into weeks, and weeks into months. Life went on, with its routine of care, of small joys, of overcome difficulties. Robert remained there, each day a little more lost, but still present. Still capable of smiling when they saw something funny, still capable of squeezing a hand when he needed comfort. And the family, that family that had almost fallen apart, was rebuilding itself. It wasn't the same as before, it never would be. The scars were there, visible, painful when touched, but they were scars that told a story of survival, of struggle, of love that refused to die. One afternoon in March, the sun finally shone brightly, melting the accumulated snow. Winter was ending, giving way to spring. They took Robert to the porch, sat him in a comfortable chair, and stayed there, all together, feeling the warmth of the sun on their faces. Robert looked at the garden, at the first flowers beginning to bloom, and said with surprising clarity, "Spring has arrived." And he smiled, a wide, genuine smile, as if for a moment everything made sense again. And they smiled back, knowing that that moment, like all good moments, would pass. But also knowing that while it lasted, it was real. It was precious. It was theirs. David looked at Michael, and the two exchanged a look that said everything. It said they had made it. They hadn't solved everything, they hadn't erased the past, they hadn't cured their father, but they had achieved the most important thing. They had become a family. Again. They had started to care again. They had come back together. And in the end, that's what mattered. Not perfection, not the absence of problems, but presence, being there for each other, on good days and on bad days. Because family isn't about never making mistakes. It's about trying again, even after making mistakes. It's about forgiving, even when it hurts. It's about staying, even when it's easier to walk away. The sun continued to shine, spring continued to arrive, and they continued there together, facing whatever came, because now they knew that together they were stronger. Together they could endure. Together they were a true family. And while Robert slept in the afternoon, peaceful in the warmth of the sun, the three of them stayed on the porch talking about the future, about small plans, about the next day. Not about distant years or impossible dreams, just about the next day, because when you care for someone who might not be here tomorrow, you learn to value each today. Night fell slowly, and with it a peace that had been hard-won. A peace that wasn't perfect, that could be broken at any moment by a crisis, by a bad day, by a painful memory. But it was peace. It was what they had, and it was enough. Before going to bed, David entered his father's room one last time. Robert slept deeply, his breathing calm, his face relaxed. David adjusted the blanket, kissed his forehead and whispered, "Good night, Dad. We're here. We're not leaving." And he left the room, closing the door slowly. In the hallway he found Michael, who had had the same idea. The two looked at each other and smiled, a knowing smile of those who share the same burden and the same hope. "We did it," Michael said. "It's not over yet." "I know, but we made it this far, and that's a lot." And it was. It was a lot. It was everything, in fact. Because love is not measured in happy endings, it's measured in moments. In daily choices to stay when it would be easier to leave, in forgiveness granted even when the anger still hurts, in care given even when tiredness seems unbearable. And they had chosen to stay. They had chosen to forgive. They had chosen to care. And because of that, that family, which had been on the brink of an abyss, had found a way back, not to where they were before, but to a new place, a place built on painful truths, but also on true love. The story had no ending, because family stories never do. They continue day after day, with their highs and lows, their joys and sorrows. But this story had reached a point where it was possible to breathe, to look back and realize that, despite everything, it had been worth it. And as the house slept, as the melted snow turned into water running through the gutters, as spring prepared to fully blossom, those four, Robert lost in his own mind but surrounded by love, Eleanor tired but grateful, and the two sons who had chosen to stay were what they always should have been, a family, imperfect, bruised, but a family. And that, in the end, was all that truly mattered. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.